It's a pleasure to welcome the class of 2019 and the entering transfer students and the rest of our community, Tufts community, here tonight for our common reading lecture. We are honored to have Eboo Patel with us tonight. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dean Alan Selma and his colleagues from Tisch College, as well as Greg McGonigal and his team at the University Chaplaincy for their collective work on the Common Reading Program in tonight's event. The Common Reading Program is an important collective experience in the Tufts community. Over the past 10 years, the program has fostered critical dialogue on our campus, engaging students, faculty, and staff in the discussions of timely and challenging issues that are core to the Tufts mission. The program serves as an introduction to our new intellectual community and provides an opportunity for community building with your peers and future mentors. We are asking you to reflect on your own experiences and deeply examine your own expectations as you join an environment with individuals from a wide variety of backgrounds, each bringing their own experience and perspective. We chose Active Faith because it pushes the reader to explore ideas of pluralism in its widest possible sense. In addition, this book explores the concept of active citizenship that is one of Tufts' core values. Our hope is that tonight's lecture sparks discussion, not just in the classroom, but in your residence halls, over a meal in Carmichael or DeWick, or throughout the rest of the campus community. Let this be one of the many conversations that you'll engage in over the course of the year. I have distinct pleasure now of introducing Dean Alan Selma, who will introduce our guest for this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean Barker, and good evening. It's my pleasure to also welcome all of you, and it's a privilege to introduce our guest this evening, Eboo Patel, the author of this year's Common Reading book, Acts of Faith. I also want to say thank you to Dean John Barker and the entire office of the Dean of Undergraduate and Graduate Students, as well as Greg McGonigal and his team at the Tufts University Chaplaincy for partnering with Tisch College on this year's Common Reading book and on today's program. Tisch College, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a unique institution at Tufts whose mission is to reach across the entire university to instill in all 10,000 students on this campus in Boston and in Grafton the values, the skills, and the knowledge to be informed and active citizens. We accomplish this in many interesting and exciting ways, and I hope you'll visit our website, activecitizen.tufts.edu, to learn more about Tisch College and how you can engage with us. But one way is to take advantage of our Distinguished Speaker Series, which brings major public figures to campus to discuss important issues of the day with the Tufts community. Last year, we hosted Senator Elizabeth Warren, former Senator Scott Brown, and former Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, among others. Later this month, on September 30th, we will feature Reggie Love, the former personal assistant or body man to President Obama. And later in the semester, we have programs planned with the former Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, and a program on women in politics with Boston City Councilor Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Catherine Clark, and State Representative Keiko Oral. One way and that's enough of the commercial. One way we reach students, even before you set foot on campus, is by participating in the Common Reading book program. We select books and authors that touch on important public issues and that encourage discussion across differences. We are very honored to welcome Eboo Patel to the Tufts campus this evening to talk about his book, Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim, the struggle for the soul of a generation. A book which President Bill Clinton called a beautifully written story of discovery and hope. I asked Eboo how he wanted me to introduce him this evening, and he said to try to avoid the boilerplate. I'm just going to put in a little bit, if I may. Eboo Patel grew up in Illinois and attended the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he earned a bachelor's degree in sociology. And it was there that he first became interested in issues of religious diversity. He went on to receive a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. His experiences have taught him that diversity, service, and faith are important components of civic life, and this led to his founding of the Interfaith Youth Corps. The IFYC is an organization that nurtures and networks interfaith youth leaders, and it partnered with the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships to launch the President's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge. Eboo is one of the nation's most respected voices on religious pluralism. He blogs for the Washington Post and USA Today, and he's spoken at the Clinton Global Initiative and the Nobel Peace Prize Forum. What has impressed me most today is that he came to Tufts not only to talk, but to act. He and his colleagues, Rebecca Russo, have conducted workshops today for students, faculty, and staff to share their wisdom on advancing religious and philosophical pluralism and interfaith cooperation at Tufts. And for the mark that you will leave here, we thank you, Eboo. We are pleased to welcome Eboo Patel to Tufts to talk about some of the core themes of his work and of his life: inclusion, community, leadership, and service, which are also signature values of this university. Please welcome Eboo Patel.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you. So it may be that my favorite place to be in the fall is an American college campus, but I'm especially happy today because I particularly relish being on campuses that I was not smart enough to get admitted to as an undergraduate student. And I love the idea that I get to get called back to come talk to all of you. So thank you for being smart enough to get into Tufts, and thank you for being modest enough to have me as your freshman convocation speaker today. I was going through in my head the list of grads that I know from Tufts University, and of course, being here on campus, it has doubled over the course of the day. The people that I remember who went here, or who I was told went here: Varun Soni, who's the first non-Christian dean of religious life at a major research university in America, USC, was a student here. Vanessa Kirsch, who founded Public Allies, which was one of the organizations I looked up to, and I was an undergrad at the University of Illinois in the early 1990s, came here. Farah Pandit, who was Secretary Clinton's first envoy to Muslim communities in the Clinton State Department just a few years ago. My friend Nathan Render. Nathan, are you here? Some in the audience? Hey, Nathan. Haven't seen you for a while. My friend Nathan Render was an undergrad here. He was one of the first employees of the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, which may be the single most focused and effective foundation in the area of helping people get along better together. My friend Jen Bailey, who was a classmate of Nathan's here, started the Faith Matters Network, which is about bridging people who have little means to people with more means in the American South. My friend Dave Garrett, Dr. Dave Garrett, he's somewhere in the audience here. Dave is the most humanistically oriented doctor that I know. His wife was a friend of mine in grad school and sends me the list of books Dave has read over the course of the year every December. It's 120 books. I was a liberal arts major in college. I'm I haven't read this many books in a decade. I question whether Dave has a job. Apparently he does. And he takes good care of his 2 kids, and he manages to read 120 books a year. So someday I'll figure out how you do that, Dave. As I was going through all of these folks, I was thinking to myself, one of the things that they have in common that is common across this range of professions, diversity, community and nonprofit work, medicine, is the importance of interfaith leadership. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Why does it matter to become an interfaith leader? What is the relevance of it in your personal life, in professional life, in civic life, in national and global leadership? I usually want to start for a moment with Farah. So, Secretary Albright in 2006 writes a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, where she recalls her days as the chief diplomat, the Secretary of State in the Clinton administration in the 1990s. And she says that if she goes back and thinks about the deepest foreign policy tangles of her time as Secretary of State, the war in the Balkans, the rise of Al-Qaeda, which is marked by the bombing of the USS Cole and the bombings in East Africa, the test of a nuclear device in India, which gets dubbed the Hindu bomb, the response by Pakistan, which gets dubbed the Muslim bomb, of course, the hot and then cold peace process in the Middle East, the Omagh bombing in Northern Ireland, which nearly derails the peace process there, and finally the Good Friday Accords. She goes back through all of these and she thinks to herself, the energies at the center of all of these diplomatic challenges were religious energies. In Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia, soldiers putting up the number 3 would ride in their tanks into largely Muslim Sarajevo. The 3 stood for the Trinity, as in, we Christians are going to roll over you Muslims. Al-Qaeda announces its global ambitions with the bombing of the USS Cole in the mid-1990s. A nuclear war is just barely diverted in South Asia with those nuclear tests. And Albright surveys the diplomats at the State Department, thousands and thousands of diplomats. And she says, you know what? For all of these various economic crises, I had armies of people that I could deploy. But for these religious energies we were dealing with, which was the main crisis of the 1990s, and this, remember, is a pre-9/11 world, I had exactly one person at the State Department schooled in religious issues. Secretary Clinton shifts that rapidly. One of the things that she does is she creates a position called the Special Envoy to Muslim communities and appoints Farah in that position. But I think to myself that what Farah learned here at the Fletcher School was absolutely key to her effectiveness as a representative of the United States of America, engaging Muslim communities everywhere from Pakistan to Indonesia to China. Farah needed to be an interfaith leader. She needed to be somebody who was able to deal positively with people who orient around religion differently in order to be an effective diplomat. Let's turn for a moment to medicine. One of my favorite books recently is a book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's a book about a Hmong family in Merced, California. The Hmong are a mountain people who are originally from Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. They were allies of the United States' efforts in the Vietnam War, and in return, the United States resettles a number of them, largely in the upper Midwest and out on the West Coast. The Hmong are shamans. That's their religious tradition, and it pervades their entire lens on life. And when the Liu family discovered that their 1-year-old daughter was starting to have seizures and brought her to the local hospital in Merced, California, the response by the doctors shocked them, because the doctors responded only as if this was a medical condition, only as if it was caused by an electromagnetic storm in the mind. But the Liu family saw something different. As shamans, they believed that part of what was happening was their little girl, 1 year old, who they were undoubtedly concerned for, but also proud of, also joyful for, because the Hmong believe that one of the ways you get prepared to be a shaman is through seizures at an early age. The 40 various medical professionals who dealt with young Lisa Liu over the course of the time that she went through seizures had zero idea that the Hmong had a religious tradition which colored their worldview on how they saw seizures. One of the doctors got so angry that this family didn't administer the required medicine to their daughter that he had the state take the daughter away and put in foster care. One of the administrators on the medical form where it said religion checked none. If you are going to be a doctor, you are going to have to learn to understand the religious worldviews your patients bring in. It affects how they view their conditions. It affects what they do when deaths occur. It affects what they do when births occur. It affects what they can eat and cannot eat in the hospital cafeteria. If you're going to be a doctor, it's not just the science you need to know. It's the humanities as well. It's the ability to empathize and engage the religious, philosophical, and ethical identity of your patient base. Jen Bailey, when she does her divinity school degree at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, is absolutely shocked by the deprivation she sees in the American South. Absolutely shocked by the inequality. People who had to choose between food and heat during the winter. And one of the things that struck her the most was how faith communities could quickly mobilize into positive action to impact those people's lives. She began to develop a vision. What would it look like if in the American South, long the bastion of American evangelicism, was able to bridge positively to the rapidly growing Muslim, Hindu, Jain, and Jewish communities in cities like Nashville and in Atlanta? And if that bridged social capital could be mobilized to the benefit of people who suffered the most economically in this country. In order for that to happen, Jen Bailey needed to have knowledge of Robert Putnam's theory of bridge social capital, needed to recognize just how large a source of social capital diverse religious communities in America are. Professor Putnam, not far away at Harvard University, says the single largest source of social capital in America is our religious communities. And the single greatest potential we have in a civic way is to bridge those communities in common action together. Unfortunately, those bridges so rarely occur because people don't know how to build them. Jen Bailey is helping to transform economic inequality in the American South because she learned how to build those interfaith bridges. Nathan Render, when he was at the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, and they were putting together their strategy of what does it look like to take a rigorous and scientific approach to helping people get along better. Amongst the greatest challenges in America and the world today, how do we help people from different backgrounds get along better? They also looked at Professor Putnam's research, this time a book done by Putnam and David Campbell, a sociologist at Notre Dame University, a book called American Grace, where they discover through a quantitative survey that people's attitudes towards people of different backgrounds increases dramatically when they have a single friend from a different religious community. And interestingly enough, their attitudes towards other religious minorities increase as well, which is to say that if you have a Mormon friend, if you come to know that person from the LDS tradition through basketball or a science lab or a choir, it not only increases your attitudes towards your LDS friend, but towards the Muslim, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh communities as well. It was rigorous social science like this which helped Nathan and the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust create their philanthropic strategy. 4 different examples, and I can go on and on and on into the world of education and into the world of social work, into the world of politics. But the bottom line is that interfaith leadership frameworks, knowledge, and skills is an absolutely essential set of tools that you will need to be a leader in the 21st century. And let's make no mistake about this. You come to Tufts to be leaders. I just had to rattle off just a handful of the grads I know from this place. It's not exhaustive at all. Those people are leaders. They made a huge impact in America and the world. You come here to become leaders. And one of the areas we need leadership in the most is in what it means to create a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. Because I carry with me the baggage of graduate school, let me define each of those terms. You, by the way, after a year or two here, will do the same thing that I will. You will start using geeky language like, let me define my terms. And your parents at the Thanksgiving table will say, who are you? And you will say, I am a tough student. You wanted that, remember, Mom? Let me define my terms. Democracy, not just a place where people can vote. A place where people get to make their personal convictions public. Democracy, a place where people can make their personal convictions public. If you have a notion of how you want the world to be based on your religious or gender or racial or philosophical or ethical viewpoint, you can hand out flyers advancing that view at the bus stop. You can try to elect somebody for office. You can start a nonprofit organization. You can run for office yourself. You can find a law that you don't like and try to sue to overturn that law. You can go to a city council meeting and advocate for a new budget priority. Democracy, a place where people get to make their personal convictions public. Diversity. Now, in elementary school, you heard things like, diversity is our strength. Celebrate diversity. Things get a lot more complicated at this level. Diversity is not all samosas and egg rolls. Diversity is not just the food that tastes good. Diversity is not just the differences you like, it is also the differences you don't like. Diversity is disagreement. In a diverse democracy, people get to make their divergent, opposing, conflicting views public. That leads to conflict. That leads to tension. Welcome to a diverse democracy. Religion. My favorite definition of religion comes from the great theologian Paul Tillich. He says that religion is ultimate concerns. Things like creation, the purpose of human life, salvation. Things that religion kind of uniquely addresses in powerful ways like that. But also, religion invests what could be pedestrian ideas with a sense of ultimacy. That's not a random group of people. That is the Ummah. That's not just any old day. This is Eid al-Adha. That's not just any piece of real estate. God gave that to people who pray like me. Without religion, these could be looked at as pedestrian concerns. A random group of people, another patch of land, just another day in the calendar. But religion invests these things with ultimacy. Religiously diverse democracy. A place where people who disagree on matters of ultimate concerns get to have their disagreements made public. And if you ask the question, why is it that every time I open the New York Times, somebody is killing somebody else to the soundtrack of prayer? That is the answer. Because a religiously diverse democracy is a place where people are constantly vying to get their notion of what is ultimately good supreme in the civic space. What does it mean to help to create a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? Well, one thing is people shouldn't be killing one another over these things. Another thing is that it's not a place where people agree on everything. The resolution to diversity is not people agree with me. The resolution to diversity is the recognition that even though we disagree on some fundamental things, we can work together on other fundamental things. What interfaith leaders do in a religiously diverse democracy is create spaces where people who orient around religion differently are able to disagree in healthy ways on some fundamental things and work together on other fundamental things. What does it mean to be an interfaith leader? What does it mean to accomplish this? What does it mean to build healthiness into the volatile situation of a religiously diverse democracy? I want to go through 4 parts of interfaith leadership. Part 1 is having a radar screen for these things, having a lens through which religious diversity and interaction registers itself. One of my favorite stories about this comes from Stansfield Turner, who was the director of the CIA in the late 1970s when a little thing called the Iranian Revolution took place. And when he was asked after he retired, how was it that the U.S. foreign policy apparatus entirely missed the Iranian Revolution? This was his confession. That the CIA and the State Department and the Pentagon had files on Iran when it came to lots of things. Iranian film, Iranian art, Iranian politics, Iranian music. What they ignored was Iranian religion. And of course, all this time, the Ayatollah Khomeini was based in Paris, sending back to Iran, to his large and growing group of followers, cassette tapes of his sermons of what the Iranian Republic should really look like in his vision. That's what leads to the Iranian Revolution. That is the radar screen that the director of the CIA, and by his admission, a large part of the American foreign policy establishment, did not have. You have to develop a radar screen for religious diversity issues. What does it mean to walk into a classroom with people who orient around religion differently, who might have very different takes on Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon or Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses? What does it mean if you are a doctor to walk into a hospital wing and think to yourself, the people who I am treating have very different views of what their medical conditions might be than I might have. If they are Hmong shamans, they might see seizures as a path to a kind of sainthood. As a doctor, I have to take into account that other kind of worldview. What does it mean to develop a radar screen for religious diversity? One of my mental exercises every day is to read the New York Times front to back and mentally mark in my mind every article that has some religious dimension to it. And if I were to cut those articles out and look at the paper that I have left, there's not much. Which is to say, once you develop your interfaith radar screen, you will find things hitting it at all times. Because the issues of how religiously diverse people interact in this country and beyond are mammoth. They will keep on coming at you. That's the first thing, developing a radar screen for interfaith issues. The second thing is developing an appreciative knowledge of other traditions. Let me tell you this by way of a story. So I was in Kansas City a few years ago. Anybody here from Kansas City? Yeah, I like your city. I'm going to impugn it just mildly right now, but I like your city. I was just there, great barbecue, and the Royals are a heck of a baseball team. So I'm in Kansas City. Maybe this is like, 6 or 8 years ago. And I'm, doing a talk, and somebody stands up in the Q&A session and says some version of, what the hell is wrong with you Muslims? And, I'm generally a mellow guy. I joke that I play the Muslim Mr. Rogers on TV. But for whatever reason, I just got mad at that moment, and I kind of went through the roof. And I looked at this cat, and I was like, you know what? If the only thing I knew was the first minute of the local news in Kansas City, I would run up in this place and be like, what the hell is wrong with you folks in Kansas City? Bunch of rapists and murderers. Because by definition, the first minute of the evening news on the local broadcast in any city in America is the bad stuff. You only know that version of Islam, the first minute of the evening news. You know nothing about the poetry of Rumi. You know nothing about the courage of Malala Yousafzai. You know nothing about the fact that the Sears Tower was designed by a Muslim architect. You seem to have forgotten that some of the greatest American athletes, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon, were Muslim. You seem to have forgotten that the past couple of Nobel Prizes in literature, at least a recent one, was won by a Muslim figure, Orhan Pamuk from Turkey. You only know the bad stuff about my religion. And that means you can't call yourself an educated person. What does it mean to develop an appreciative knowledge of other traditions? Traditions that you, of course, are going to disagree with in some way. And yet, you can find dimensions of beauty in them. Yet, you can find moments and points of contact, moments of resonance between your own belief system and those. In my view, there's no way you can be an interfaith leader in America or anywhere in the world without developing an appreciative knowledge. Things that you find beautiful, things that you find positive, things that inspire you from other traditions. Third part of what it means to be an interfaith leader is knowing something of the history of interfaith cooperation. I was finalizing a book manuscript in a coffee shop a few years back, and somebody stops by and says, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm finishing a manuscript on religious diversity and peacemaking in America. And he's like, religion and peace? Religions have always fought. They will always fight. End of story. That is a dominant narrative out there. In fact, it was given academic heft by a man who died just a few years ago, not far from here, Sam Huntington at Harvard University, calls it the clash of civilizations. This notion of the inevitability of religious conflict based on what he and many others believe is simply a long history and comprehensive history of religious conflict. The problem with that story is that it's not entirely true. There is just as much of a history of interfaith cooperation, just as much a history of people who orient around religion differently joining together to do positive, meaningful, beautiful, inspiring things. But if you don't know that history, then people advancing the clash of civilizations narrative win. So what are some examples of that history? When I hear Pope Francis telling churches in Europe that it is their responsibility to welcome the Muslim refugees from Syria washing up on the shores of Mediterranean countries and countries in Eastern Europe, that it's their responsibility to welcome them in, I think of his namesake, the man from which he borrowed a name, St. Francis of Assisi, in the year 1219, at the time of the Fifth Crusade, travels from his home in Italy to Egypt to meet with the Sultan Malik at a time when his people, Christians, and Sultan Malik's people, Muslims, were at war with each other. And in the court of the Sultan Malik, they talk not war but prayer. And historians say that the multiple times a day of Franciscan prayer, that is now a part of what it means to be a priest in the Franciscan order, came from Francis observing what Muslims in the Sultan's court did. If you don't know that history, you don't know how deep this current pope is reaching back into the history of the church, back into the history of Christian-Muslim relations, to call on a moment of inspiration that he wants to relive and reinterpret today. You might think that Muslims and Christians have only ever fought. You might think that the prime ministers of countries in Europe that says, we are largely Christian, therefore we can't have any Muslims here, are right. But if you listen to the Pope, and if you know the history, you'll know that there's something different. You'll know that there's an alternative. You'll know that there's a possibility that, if life is breathed into it, can become a reality. Example 2, knowing the history of interfaith cooperation. Anybody see the film Selma? You know, I love that movie, right? You got to show that here, Greg. A lot of first-year students here who need to see that movie. So I'm going to give you an interfaith lens through which to see that film. And I love that film because it's the story of these young folks in America making this deep, deep change. Now, the central figure of the story is John Lewis. He's 25 years old and he gets his head cracked open on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He's the one who starts the notion of the march. And where did John Lewis get his courage? John Lewis got his courage from the Bible. John Lewis loved the Bible so much, wanted to be a preacher so much, that when he was 7 or 8 years old and his job at his farm, at his family farm, was taking care of the chickens, he'd get them to do all their chicken stuff. I don't know what chicken stuff is. He'd get them to do their chicken stuff, and then he would preach Bible verses to the chickens. And those Bible verses were playing in his head as he approached the police truncheons that March day on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And when he brought Martin Luther King Jr. back a few weeks later, and King was feeling a little despondent, a little low, what does King do? King calls Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer, and says, "Sing some Jesus to me, Mahalia." And there's this beautiful midnight moment of Mahalia Jackson singing gospel hymns to Martin Luther King Jr. Who else was in Selma? Dan Berrigan, the great Jesuit priest who gives this sermon. Where is the church? Is it the bricks and mortar from where we came? Or is it here in the streets of Selma? And miles away, there is this nun in full habit on Highway 80. And she says, as of answering Dan Berrigan, "We are the church." James Reeb, the great Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, you do know that your university here has UU roots, right? So a man named James Reeb hears Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to go down to Selma, and he goes. And in those marches, he is set upon by a group of racists, and he loses his life there. And one of the great pictures, not just of the Civil Rights Movement, but in all of American history, with Martin Luther King Jr. marching arm in arm with this white man with this big, bushy beard. You know who that white man is? A man named Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a man who barely escaped the trains going from Warsaw to Auschwitz, saw 6 million of his people burned in Hitler's hellfires, had every right when he gets his position on the Upper West Side of New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary to go there and only focus on his own people. And yet, here's King's call and decides that the soul of Judaism is at stake in the civil rights movement, goes, marches arm in arm with King and says, I know that King and I have different liturgies. I know that we worship in different ways, but in Selma, with him, I felt like my legs were praying. In a little-known moment in history, Malcolm X, fresh from the Hajj in Mecca, the Hajj which is going on right now, time when millions of Muslims gather in Mecca for 10 days of prayer and ritual and community gathering, ending in just 3 days on Eid. Malcolm X is fresh from Hajj. He comes back with a different heart and a different mind. And he goes to a church in Selma and he preaches reconciliation. And just a few months later is gunned down at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. What am I saying? I'm saying that if you have your interfaith radar screen on, and if you watch that film carefully, it is a history lesson in interfaith cooperation. So don't tell me that religious communities have only always ever fought, and they only always ever will, because there is powerful, beautiful, inspiring evidence of the alternative. All we need is enough people to believe in that possibility and make it a reality. What does it mean to make it a reality? Ultimately, an interfaith radar screen, knowledge of interfaith history, having an appreciative understanding of other traditions, these are all preparation, right? What does it mean to make it a reality, to bring people who orient around religion differently together in ways that affirm understanding and cooperation? It means the ability to curate those spaces. It's one of the reasons I love Tufts the most. It's your focus on service learning, on community action and research. It's embodied in the Tisch School of Citizenship, but really it's embodied in the ethos of this university. And it's one of the most powerful ways of bringing people who orient around religion differently together. How many of you over the time of your high school career before have done a Habitat for Humanity build? Been involved in that kind of service project? So one of the things I love about Habitat for Humanity is that it starts only in part as an organization dedicated to ending poverty housing. It starts also as an organization dedicated to ecumenical and interfaith community building. Millard Fuller famously calls this the theology of the hammer. And he says that he was deeply distressed that people from different doctrinal dimensions of Christianity would refuse to come into the same room together. They would disagree so deeply on major things like Jesus or minor things like what the pastor should wear to church that they would not even consider themselves part of the same community. He wanted to create an activity. He wanted to curate a space where those people could come together in positive ways, and the activity that he discovered was building houses together. I love this vision of what it looks like to curate a space where people from different backgrounds who would disagree on all sorts of other things. They might disagree on the politics of abortion or the politics of the Middle East, but they do not let some fundamental divides separate them entirely. They commit that they will find some things to do together. Millard Fuller created that space in Habitat for Humanity. That's a big part of what Greg and Zach and the Office of the Chaplaincy, it's a big part of what Alan and the Tisch School of Citizenship is about. Of course, in a religiously diverse democracy, you are going to have fundamental disagreements with other people. Welcome to the definition of diversity. Are you going to let those fundamental disagreements forever separate you from those people? If you disagree with where the line should be drawn in Jerusalem, and you are going to be a heart surgeon, and your colleague who is also a heart surgeon thinks the line should be drawn elsewhere, would you not perform heart surgery next Tuesday with that person? Would you let a patient die on a table because you disagree with the politics of the Middle East, or the politics of abortion, or the politics of same-sex marriage? All of those are fundamental issues. So is heart surgery. So is a Habitat for Humanity build. So is, I think, American civic life embodied in everything from the bowling league to the PTA. I think what college is about is the ability to articulate your views on those fundamental things, register your differences, and find ways to come together. People who can curate those space are people I call interfaith leaders, and in my mind, they're some of the most important people in a religiously diverse democracy. Here's what I want to close with. I want to close with just how powerful it is to be at the beginning, right? I mean, I think back, and I'm pushing 40. I'll cross that line in about 8 weeks. Never thought I'd get here, especially didn't when I was 17 and sitting in your chairs. And I think to myself, the last 20, 25 years has been amazing for me. I got to be with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. I got to see Mandela speak in Cape Town. I got to be there at the inauguration of the first black president. But I would trade places with you in a second. I would be at the beginning again at the drop of a hat, because there was nothing for me like college. The world never felt as new or as open or as possible as when I was 17 years old in my first classes, walking across the quad, playing my first pickup basketball games as an undergrad. And I'm jealous. I'm envious that you get to be at the beginning of that who you think you are now, in 3 weeks, you might wake up and think you are something totally different. And guess what? You can do that. This is college. These are your undergraduate years. There's this beautiful line by Howard Thurman, who was the dean of the chapel not far from here at Boston University. He says of his college years at Morehouse College, he says that college puts a crown above your head and challenges you to rise to achieve it. I love that notion, right? I love Paul Ricoeur's line about narrative identity. He says, think of a baby picture of yourself. Imagine yourself holding it in your hand, and then look at yourself in the mirror and think, what connects these two entities? I'm so radically different today than you were as a baby. What connects those two things? It's the stories you tell yourself about yourself. And so much of what college is telling yourself different, exciting, refreshing stories about yourself. If you came here and you were dead set on being a lawyer, wake up tomorrow morning and tell yourself a story about being a doctor. If you came here and you were dead set on your atheist convictions, wake up tomorrow and imagine what it was like to be somebody whose Catholicism was hidden for a half century in Cuba and got to be with the Pope. Play those games. Tell those stories to yourself. Connect that narrative identity. You'll never have another chance to do it. You'll never be this free again. You'll never have that mental space, that imaginative opportunity. I leave you with this line, one of my favorite lines in the humanistic canon. It's this beautiful line by the French writer Marcel Proust. For me, it's what college is all about. He says that the true journey of discovery is not in seeing new landscapes. It is in developing new eyes. May that mark your time here, the development of new eyes. Thank you.
So can we please give another round of applause for a conversation that was an intellectual, cultural, and historical trek through interfaith religion. So thank you very much. Eboo has agreed to answer a few questions. So if you could please line up at either mic, we will take questions from the audience. And we'll give you a minute to do that. That's great.
Go ahead. You're first.
I am. So I think that that it's crucial to connect with others to build a brighter future. With that understanding, why is religion any more important than other kinds of diversity, like cultural, racial, or socioeconomic diversity? I have friends who are non-Jews who are a lot more similar to me than many of the Jews who I know. So why is religion the dominant component upon which we should try to bridge those gaps?
Yeah, I don't think it is more important than those other things. I just happen to have written a book about religious diversity, and I happen to have started an organization on that. So I think that all those other dimensions of diversity are very important, and I'm certainly not arguing for religion above those things. But I do think that it's in that same stratosphere, so to speak. And I think that one of the things that American education does quite well is prepare people to have a radar screen for issues around race, gender, class, increasingly sexuality. It doesn't mean it does it well enough, but my sense is that there's some attention given to that. And my sense is that there is relatively little given to issues of religious diversity. So my hope in this is just to register it, right? Is not to replace a radar screen that you might have around racial diversity issues with a religious diversity radar screen, simply to to expand your radar screen to include these issues too. Does that work for you?
Yeah, thank you.
Fist bump. Thank you.
Hi. So I totally agree with what you said about how college gives you new eyes. And
in 3 days on campus?
No, I'm a sophomore.
Okay, gotcha. A year and 3 days. Yeah,
but with these new eyes, you start to see kind of the inadequacies in the structure, in the government, in different institutions. And that brings kind of like a pessimistic view of how institutions really fail us. And can you speak to how we can create spaces for marginalized voices when the system is kind of inherently inherently exclusive?
Yes. Thank you for that question. So I think you made two different points. The first is seeing the inadequacy of institutions, and secondly, creating spaces for marginalized voices, right? So these are related, but I want to separate them for a moment. So I'll just give you briefly my experience on this. I think so when I first started in interfaith work in the mid to late 1990s, one of the things that frustrated me was it was largely religious authority figures, people with collars and lots of letters before and after their names on stage, on panels, doing formal things. And I looked at it and I'm like, this is marginalizing young people. It is not the format in which we normally engage. It's not the language that we feel comfortable in, et cetera, et cetera. And for 5 years, I pounded on the table. And I was like, you have to include more young people. You have to create spaces for young people. You have to create projects for young people. And lots of well-meaning people looked at me and nodded sympathetically. And then one not so well-meaning person said to me very sharply the words that changed my life. If you think it's so bad and you think you're so smart, start it your damn self. It's called Interfaith Youth Corps. And why did those words change my life? Because, start it your damn self, right? That if one of the wonderful things about American civil society and democracy is you can actually do that. If you think something is going wrong, you can create an alternative. You can advocate for a different policy. You can write an article. You can show up at a city council meeting. And that sharp realization, and really what it was a punch in the face, because the person was basically like, hey man, you're smart enough to criticize, but are you smart enough to create? And you take a shot at that and you fail? Feels pretty bad. Right? But at some point, kid, your criticism, it's just talk, man. So either you gotta shut up and put up, or just shut up. I was 20 or 22 at the time. I was a little older than you, but it was powerful. It was powerful to hear somebody say, if you believe this enough, you should try to start it. You should stop telling other people to do something, and you should try to do it yourself. So I don't think everything works like that, but a lot of things work like that. And so my own view is that critique has a role, but creating is so much more beautiful, so much more challenging, and so much more satisfying. Does that respond to your question?
Hi. I think one of the things that I've struggled with over the past 2 and a little years here on campus is sort of the difference between pluralism and secularism. And I think that this idea sort of in the American public sphere and in the institution that we're pluralistic actually in practice becomes a kind of assumed secularism. In which really like religious wisdom or the idea that maybe someone's actually on a spiritual journey is not really welcome or valued in actual public space. Like we kind of, the Jews like go in their corner to go pray, and the Muslims, do their thing over there, and and we come together to talk about what we do, but there's never really a sense that like myself as a religious spiritual seeker is something that would be welcome in a public space. Like the idea that I could actually raise my hand in a class and like say something that I learned from a religious text or a spiritual question that I'm asking that actually is alive for me and authentic is like kind of ridiculous. It's like, who are you? Like faith in this country has become something that's for stupid people who are not educated. Like that's how I feel sometimes. I think you spoke in beautiful terms about, religion is something we need to study and know, like on an ideological sense, so we can be good professionals. But what does this mean in terms of like my life as a seeker, looking for spiritual community?
Man, what a great question. So, look, part of that is just the geography that you're in, right? I gave a talk at Harvard Div School a few years ago. I paused 20 minutes in. I was like, do any of you believe in God? Like a couple hands went up, But I'm in, Charleston, South Carolina 2 or 3 years ago, and I swear to God, every other person in the airport comes up to me. They're like, my name is Mary Sue. What church do you go to? And I'm like, do I know you? But that's what pervades the public square in different regions in America is very, very different, right? But I fully agree with you that there is a secular bias in coastal America, in urban America, and in higher education. And the notion is that if you have a religious identity, it's private, it will be accommodated, but don't make too much noise, right? And if you register it, it is a peculiarity. It's not core, right? It's a peculiarity. It's a mark on your face, so to speak. I think I don't know what to say about that. There are other places in the country and the world, like I said, where the air feels very different, right? Like, so, the handful of times I've been to majority Muslim countries, everything is masha'Allah, insha'Allah, bismillah, salamu alaikum, right? It's like, it's in the air all the time. And, but of course, that is a particular religious language. And if I were to think to myself, what if I wasn't Muslim in this environment? Would I feel more marginalized by the presence of a particular religious language? And of course, I imagine, because you go to Tufts, your philosophical rejoinder would be, yes, but isn't secular language a particular language? And doesn't the dominance of secular language, in fact, marginalize particular religiosity? I think that these are fascinating and interesting questions, and they deserve a course. In fact, ask Greg to teach that course. Religious pluralism in the American secular square. This is what I do when I'm not smart enough to answer a question. I create a course. I'm like, let's do a bunch of reading together and we'll figure it out. Thank you for your question, though. I think you put great words to a significant challenge.
Hi, you kind of touched on this already, but I'm an atheist, secular humanist kind of dealie, and I was wondering if you had any kind of specific advice about making sure, like, people like myself who are, like, more out of the loop are, like, very understanding and especially cooperative? Because I feel like that's a harder demographic to come across, and I was wondering if you had any tips.
So, are you asking what tips I have for you on this, or what tips I should give to myself to make sure that an interfaith organization is appropriately open to people from atheist, agnostic, secular humanist viewpoints?
Both, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's an excellent question. I mean, Greg has done a great job in this. One of his first hires is Zach, right behind you there, who's a secular humanist. And so, and actually, you were telling me Tufts is the first university in the country to formally have a secular humanist on staff, hired by the university, right? So I think that a number of chaplaincies and interfaith organizations are getting a lot better at that. I mean, I joke at IFYC all the time that we have a staff of 40. And right now, the secular humanists on our staff can field a full softball team, and the Christians probably can't, actually. And so 5 years ago, I would go to bed thinking to myself, are we appropriately warm and friendly to atheist and secular humanist students? And if you believe that people vote by their feet, by the numbers of people who come to programs and seek to join a staff, etc., I guess the empirical answer to that question would be yes. And frankly, what I'm more concerned about right now is, are we appropriately open to evangelical Christian students? Because in the history of IFYC, over a 13-year history, 120 or so staff, we've probably had 3 evangelicals on our staff. And probably the largest student organizations in the country are evangelical student organizations. And I have to wonder to myself, what are we doing wrong that evangelical students do not think that interfaith work is respectful and friendly and welcoming to their religious identity? But I think that this is a challenge, and we have certainly grown. I have certainly grown and gotten better when it comes to atheist, secular humanist identities. If you'll notice, I'll often say faith, philosophical, and ethical identities, for example. I think the challenge is drawing the circle wide enough so that a variety of different identities, including identities who genuinely are in tension, feel comfortable in a professional or programmatic setting, and that we are smart enough to curate activities that are productive for them to engage in together. Thanks for your question.
Hello, I was really inspired by your book and your speech just now. And I just want to know that if someone came up to you and they said, they were in the same place as me, I really liked what you said, I really thought that was inspiring, but I don't know where to start, I don't know how to turn on my radar. What is the biggest piece of advice you would give to them?
What a great question. So, you are in one of the best places in the world to do this, right? So one of the things is you have this great chaplaincy at Tufts University that does this for a living and a vocation. I would go see Greg give him a day to chill out from this. He's been planning for this for 3 months. If I were him, I'd take the day off tomorrow. But go to the chaplaincy and have a conversation with Zach or Greg or Celine or one of the folks there. That would be one thing. Here's a second thing. Read the New York Times tomorrow. Set aside an hour, read the front section cover to cover, and literally clip out physically. I know that it might be hard to find a physical copy of the paper, he says, but clip out physically every article that deals with religious identity, right? And think to yourself, I am going to do this practice day after day until my radar screen for issues of religious diversity in national and global affairs is extremely fine-tuned. And then go through those articles and highlight the parts that you find inspiring. Okay? Because by its nature, the news about religion is going to largely be the opposite of inspiring. But some of it will be interesting and inspiring. Underline those parts, right? So in Saturday's New York Times, I almost moved to tears by this story of Pope Francis causing a stir at the Vatican because he is celebrating Mass in his humble apartment with the custodial staff. And the cardinals are like, what the heck is going on, right? And he's being who he is. I just find that so beautiful. And in in a world of news that's just full of blood, those moments are priceless. So that would be my advice to you. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'd like to go back to the intersection of secularism and pluralism, specifically in the United States. I think, hitting on your second point about religious education, I think a lot more could be done to improve the religious illiteracy in the United States. And I think one of the ways to do that is provide a kind of like a course on religion in public schools, and how that would improve. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm.
I know there's been some work around that in the religious community, and I think that's something that can really help target certain young people in public schools, middle school or high school, and have a large scale effect.
Yeah, I think it's a really
but also the boundary between separation of church and state, and how you struggle with that, but also I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting proposal. My friend Steve Prothero, and a mentor of mine who's also not far away here, you guys in Boston, you do realize you're a stone's throw from the greatest minds in the world, right? I mean, you can't walk to the coffee shop without running into a Nobel Prize winner in this town. But my friend Steve Prothero at Boston University advanced that idea in a great book called Religious Literacy. I think it's a great idea, right? I think that doing it is harder to do than it sounds, not only because of church-state issues, but because it's not like there is a single galactic council for all public schools in America that can wave its magic wand and require that course, right, between 10 and 10:40 every day. Every public school district is independent and different, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's certainly a proposal that's worth considering, and I think you should write your senior thesis on that.
All right, thank you. Good book.
Thank you.
Hello. In the sort of vein of do it your damn self, my question is, if it's so important for people of all professions to be very religiously literate, you gave examples of doctors, for example, should doctors be required to learn about religion, just as an example, or should they just care more? Or maybe something else that I haven't thought of, but those are the two that came to mind. Should we just care more, or should we be forced to learn it?
So, I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think that they're fascinating, right? And I think that Tufts is the kind of place where, you literally write a senior thesis on this kind of stuff. Are religious diversity issues in American medicine so salient that doctors ought to be required to learn about them? And if so, how? How would you learn about those issues, right? And how would you practice? I mean, Harvard Medical School has a program in medical anthropology, and one of the reasons for it is because medical anthropology takes seriously the cultural and religious worldviews that patients bring into hospitals and healthcare facilities. I think they require Ann Fadiman's book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. But I think you should struggle with this. I think you should write your senior thesis on this, right? Should doctors be required to have interfaith leadership and literacy skills? And you would have to figure out, well, what skills and knowledge base, how would they be taught? How would they be measured? What about people who graduated when this wasn't required but clearly are in healthcare settings in which they're relevant? I am really good at turning these around. You can see that, right? You can see that I began life as a teacher. I can make anything an assignment. So that's your assignment. Don't ask me the damn question. Do it your damn self. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I just want to say that Eboo is going to stay and sign books, and we have books out in the lobby to be purchased. But you can ask more specific questions as you come down to the front. So we're going to take one more question, but every other question we're going to stay around and do a book signing right in front. So right here, and there are books right in the lobby. So both places. So one more question.
Great.
Oh wow, I'm so lucky. So in your book, you emphasize so much getting to the youth before things of radicalization happens. And I think that's so true. But like, how do you reach the people who like, I mean, I come from like a really small town where everyone is super close-minded about like other religions, and they just condemn like all of like Islam, for example. How do you, or like radical terrorists, how do you reach the adults who are already like converted into that mindset?
Yeah, I don't. You do. You go back to your small town. You talk about what you learn in classes. You talk about the books you read. You have conversations with folks you know. And that's why this is a movement, right? That's why this is about other people becoming leaders. That's why this is about campuses being spaces that nurture interfaith literacy and leadership. It's about you asking the question, what does it look like for me to do this in my environment? I mean, I love coming to Tufts. I love Boston. I'm going to get some oysters after this. You're a small town, you go back to your small town and you figure out what that conversation looks like. And it's a really interesting mental exercise, right? What does Thanksgiving dinner look like if you are advancing in interfaith literacy discourse? What does Uncle Larry say? And how do you respond? And that's the beauty of being a college student, right? It's how do you take what you learn in college back home? My dad was mostly good-natured about the strident lectures that I gave him my freshman and sophomore years in college. I wish I was a little less strident, but it was very good practice. One of the professors I know calls college practice for the public, right? That you get to not only learn this new stuff, you get to practice how to use it. There are very few environments in the world in which you can acquire knowledge in a sociology or a biology class at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, walk across the quad, and start a student organization based on that college at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So take that opportunity, right? It was great being with you all. I will see some of you for signing books, and have a great night.